So just, I guess a really quick title. Again, I'm just going to be addressing some of the impacts of different federal policies that have on Indigenous people here in the United States. And so just wanted to start off with, this is part of one of the foundations with our Leadership Institute is really, prior to colonization and first contact, really thinking about what are our core values and what are the things that have driven us and have been foundational to our survival, and it's really rooted in the gifts of our Creator, which is centered in the land, our language, our way of life, laws and customs, our governance systems, our family, community, and natural resources. And so in our communities, we really center this as our gifts of the Creator. And these are the things that have sustained us. And these are really components that have really helped in our resiliency, but also our perseverance to be able to survive and thrive, which is centered in a lot of our core values of love, respect, compassion, faith, understanding, spirituality, balance, peace, and empathy. And also centered in our own traditional calendars. And so really, when we think about all of these, as I go through these, really this historical history that can be really heavy. And so I was kind of feeling the heaviness as I was pulling this together with just a lot of the things that have been happening recently as well, with the uncovering of unmarked graves. And so, which I'll get into in a little bit. And so just these are the things that remind us of, our affirmation and confirmation of who we are as Indigenous people and what we're rooted in and which has been key to our survival. And so part of our presentation that I've done with our students is really centering this. And so probably speaking to the choir here, but really wanting to frame out, when we think about structural racism, laying out the foundation for that. And so this was just a definition I had pulled from an article, and it's really, and part of this is to center it in the policies. And so one of the pieces of this is that, a system and centered in policies and, sorry, my screen is blocked. In public policies and institutions and cultural representations, really that are centered, that the structural racism is what has been in place since since the time of the United States coming to be. And so how these apply to the federal policies that I'm going to be talking about is also rooted in, sorry, it gets confusing with the, in the institutional racism. So how does these policies help to establish some of these institutions that perpetuate a lot of those racisms that are unfair policies and equitable opportunities and impacts based on race, that are, part of schools, hospitals, religion, individuals within institutions take on the power of the institution. And so for me, when I work with students and talking about this, it's really making those connections as how do these policies have created these institutions that have perpetuated a lot of these systemic racism that our communities are still struggling with and working through with today. And so this is just kind of like, I guess, a quick overview when we think about all the different federal policies and laws and policies. We think of them in a context really from historical as impositions that have threatened our land, our language, our religion, our laws and customs, our governance systems, our family, community environments. And so all of those gifts of the Creator that I talked about, a lot of these federal policies were impositions that really work to threaten and dismantle these systems that have been in place for our people since time immemorial. And so you can see here in this first contact is really a time of colonialism, genocide, and extermination. So I'm really not going to get into the depth of that, but I did want to acknowledge that, from like 1492 to the early 1800s, that's, almost 400 years of time that we're not even going to discuss. And so, but just some of the additional pieces that the doctrine of discovery is one systemic racism process that was, used by European monarchies to really legitimize the colonizations of lands outside of Europe. And so this is not only, which was used for Christopher Columbus to colonize and discover North of America, right? But also used as a process for colonizing other countries as well. So we won't really get into a lot of the diseases that have impacted also our people since first-time contact wars, land loss, and also just wanted to acknowledge during that time as well, our resiliency and also pushback with the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. But I did want to talk about within this time frame that there was a loss of our population. And so we went from millions of Indigenous people during this time frame almost down to less than 300. Our population was probably close to around 300, 400,000 by the 1800s. And so between 1778 and 1868, at least 367 treaties were ratified by the federal government. And so this was really one of the first, I guess, policies that were being enacted with our Indigenous people. And these treaties were really the first steps of removing us from our land. And so as folks continued to arrive from Europe and wanting to take over the land, these treaties were established with our Indigenous peoples as ways to, in exchange for our land and natural resources. And so within this time frame, as colonization and settlers continued to move westward over the period of time, there was over 367 treaties with different tribes throughout the nation. And again, during this time frame, just some context, currently we have over 536 federally recognized tribes. And so at that time, within the 1778 to 1868, there was a lot more tribes. And so to even just think about the number of treaties and then the number of tribes that are no longer in existence due to the diseases and wars and just extermination and the genocide policies. So these treaties really set up like a trust responsibility that a legally administered financial obligation on part of the US government to defend our treaty rights, land, asset, and resources. And so we can see as we move through the timeline how these have also been dismantled with different policies. So as we moved into the early 1800s, in 1824, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created. And so this was created under the Department of War. And so as an organization that was used the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created to manage Indigenous people, was used to, as we were moving off of our original homelands and being placed in different places of land slots, or to some degree where reservations were starting to be created based on the treaties. And there was still a lot of warring happening. There was still a lot of fighting. There was still a lot of resistance. And so it's really interesting that this Bureau of Indian Affairs was created under the Department of War because of a lot of the fighting that was still occurring and the resistance that was still occurring with our Indigenous people pushing back and not wanting to move from their homelands. So really the Bureau of Indian Affairs was established as a way to help to provide these processes to help us move off of our lands into these new spaces. And so in 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which gave us authorization to grant lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands. And this also correlates with the Louisiana Purchase. And so as the West and the Southeast was starting to become part of the United States, I think in the late 1820s is when the Louisiana Purchase came into, so the southern states were being part of the United States. And so with the southern parts of the state, that those lands became very admirable and wanted for cotton growing. And so as the Louisiana Purchase came to be, a lot of the landowners and that were taking over that land wanted to remove the indigenous people from that area so that they could have their land for growing cotton, which contributed a lot to the slave trade as well too, right? And so the Trail of Tears between 1831 and 1840 forcefully removed the southeastern tribes, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee from the homelands and relocated them to what was at the time known as Indian Territory. And so they were forcefully removed from their homelands, which, and there was other tribes within the time frame as well that would also be forcefully removed during, as part of this Indian Removal Act. And this was the most well-known one in terms of the number, thousands of indigenous people that were lost during the walk from the Southeast. So then 1845, again, around this time, as we're starting to move west, as the settlers are starting to move west to colonize, this Manifest Destiny was coined. And so again, in Texas was admitted as part of the Union in 1845. And so as more states were starting to be established and becoming part of the United States, you know, there was the move to move west to colonize. And so this term Manifest Destiny was coined by the United States and also destined, as many believers of the term, by God to expand its dominance and spread democracy across the West. And so you would see lots of advertisements about, you know, all of this free land on the West, through the West, to be able to colonize and to start your new homesteads. And so there was this really big push from this time frame, which also contributed to the 1864, which was another removal of the Long Walk, you know, where the Navajo were forced from their homelands into the Bosque Redondo. And so that's some local history that some of my Dene colleagues would probably be able to speak to the history of that. And so that was really forced upon by Major General Christopher Kit Carson. And so it was really, there was villages burned, their homelands were destroyed, water was destroyed, livestock was destroyed. And so when you see a lot of resistance to the naming of forest and monuments regarding Kit Carson from Indigenous people here in New Mexico, it's really centered in that because of the brutal acts that were, you know, forced upon our people, particularly the Dene, and as well as the Apaches in the South that were forced to reside at Bosque Redondo, where they were trying to relocate them to, which became more of like imprisonment encampment. And so in 1871, Congress also passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which was an act that ended the treaties and also started to create the process of developing reservations. And so in this time frame of reservations beginning to come into establishment, and so 1887, an additional law was enacted, which was the Dawes Act, which was enacted to divide reservations into individual allotments. And so reservations were barely starting to be ratified. My reservation in northern New Mexico, Hickory Apache, we were created in 1887. So right when our different types of communities and indigenous communities across the US were barely being established, a new law was already enacted to be able to divide up that reservations. And this was because, you know, settlers continued to move westward and there was wanting to take up more of the land. Also, you know, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which, you know, ended the Mexican-American War in 1848, which, you know, added New Mexico, Colorado, all of us Southwest states as part of the United States, you know, so pushing that as these became enacted as states, more land for settlers to overtake. And so the Dawes Act was really enacted, and what this really did was ended up, you know, just taking away around 60 to 100 million acres of land from many indigenous communities, and particularly for the tribes in Oklahoma. And so the tribes, the 5 tribes that I talked about that were part of the Trail of Tears, you know, were as part of the removal, were stated that they would have all this land, which was considered the Indian Territory. But in 1907, Oklahoma was established, and of course that dismantled all of the land. And then the Dawes Act really impacted the tribes in Oklahoma. And so how this has played out with different tribes throughout the US is very different. Here in New Mexico, the impact wasn't as heavy, particularly because the Pueblo nations have always been in their lands since time immemorial. My community was, we were forced into a smaller portion of our original homelands, and same with the Dene, and then the Southern Apaches as well too. But if you look across the states in terms of how we're not monolithic, and so how these acts have impacted all of our different tribal communities really plays out differently. And so as we continue to move into the early 1900s, as you know, moving away from wars and fighting and realizing that genocide and extermination was not really going to get rid of us, there was different policies that were put into place that really, which was the boarding schools. And so the process behind this was that if we were to take away our Indigenous kids and from their families and take them away from their language and their culture, they would be assimilated into the society. And so this would be as another policy that was forced upon us to assimilate us into the colonial US standing. And so really the model was to kill the Indian and save the man. And so this picture always really gets me a little emotional, because these are handcuffs that were child-sized handcuffs from or that they used when they were taking kids away from families. And so really treating kids as prisoners. And so these little handcuffs are just, really kinds of, gets a little emotional when you think about that. And the language, and so, just give me. And so 1879, the Carlisle Indian School was created, and this is just an image of all of the different boarding schools that were established throughout the United States. Here in New Mexico, we have the Santa Fe Indian School, which was established in 1890. But the Carlisle Indian School was really, I guess, set up as one of the prominent models. And it was really this school that helped to steamroll the creation of all of the other boarding schools that you see here, and also was the framework for the creating boarding schools in Canada as well. So between like 1869 and the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes and families and placed in boarding schools that were operated by the federal government. And so there was federal funding to run the schools and to continue to take children away from families. And so there was just a century of trauma that is, comes with this. And so this is a picture of young kids outside of the Santa Fe Indian School. And so really the boarding school experiences were centered in a lot of abuse, both physical and sexual, neglect, abandonment, forced removal, loss of culture and language, forced Christianity, lost traditional parenting and family structure. And so when kids were taken away from families, one of the first things that happened is that kids were stripped of their traditional regalia, forced to be in uniforms, their hairs were cut. And that really was very traumatic for a lot of Indigenous kids, because our hair is really sacred in a lot of our communities, and there's a lot of traditional cultural standing when it comes to our hair and what the significance of that means in each of these different tribal communities had various implications. And so for some people, when you cut your hair, you would only cut your hair when you lost a family member. And so you think about these young children coming into boarding schools, and one of the first things that happens is they have their hair cut. And so for them, the significance of that, being away from their parents, being ripped from their community, is the implication that maybe they lost somebody, that they lost a family member. And so, and then not even being able to connect with their parents, their grandparents, their family members. And so just those types of long terms of trauma that were instilled in our young, in these young people, that has passed on for generations. Kids were neglected of love. There was no affection, and what types of impacts does that have when kids aren't cared for and loved? We know, there's a lot of research here, in today's age around ACEs, right? The decreasing of ACEs helps to improve the livelihood. And so all of these experiences here are all indicators of high levels of childhood trauma that has really set the foundation for a lot of the traumas that we have in our communities today. And so when we talk about this with our kids, have to ask them, really have these conversations with them about, what impact did this really have on our spiritual health? What impact did this have on our physical health? What impact did this have on our mental health? And what impact did this have on our emotional health? And so really, having our loss of language, loss of culture. And so kids, when they were able to go back home, could no longer speak their language, could no longer practice. Roles were disrupted, gender roles, men who were trained at certain times. And, a lot of this training happened in our communities by practice, being in the fields, being part of learning in the space. And so when that was ripped out from them as they were in these boarding schools, it just really dismantled a lot of our cultural standings when we think about those gifts of the Creator that I had talked about in the beginning. And so also the boarding schools also served as a lot of hospitals. And so there was a lot of children, diseases really impacted our communities. Also in that time, the born diseases were still, tuberculosis was really rampant in a lot of the boarding schools. And so the loss of children was really high, the numbers, and also the schools also served as hospitals. And so this is just a pamphlet from the Department of Interior around like 1918, I think is what it says, 1916. And so it was a manual talking about Indian babies and how to keep them well. And it's really discouraging the use of cradle boards. As you can see down here on the bottom, the description talks about this is not good for the baby as it restricts the baby's movements. How would you like to have your arms and legs tied? And this is now there's research and there's actually findings that having babies in cradle boards is actually healthy. This is a healthy method for being able to care for our young people. But these were policies that were also being put into place as kids were in these at the boarding schools and in these hospitals, being forced away from practicing cultural teachings and cultural practices that have been in our communities for time immemorial. And so a lot of that is really coming to bear. If you've seen in the news recently, there's been an uncovering of thousands of unmarked graves from children from numerous residential schools in Canada and in US, but really currently right now, a lot of the uncovering of the unmarked graves is really being investigated in Canada. And there's a push for having a lot more investigation and uncovering here in the US as well. But currently this is a map. And so this is a map of all the boarding schools in the Canada region. And the red marks are those schools that have not been investigated yet. The blues are the ones where they have done some investigation of the land of where the schools resided and where they've been able to find some of these unmarked graves. And then the yellow is the blue and the yellow is where the areas of where they're still searching, and then the red is they have it. And so just this past week in September 30th, a few days ago, was the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. And so this was the first annual, and was really pushed by the Indigenous people to have, to start having these conversations about the impact of boarding schools and, really with the rise of these unmarked graves and the survivors of boarding schools and its implications. And so also here in the US, as part of acknowledgement of this day, as well as the National Day of Remembrance for US boarding schools. And so I put a link there. If there's more information, and I'll also attach a PDF file that kind of gives into some more details of the boarding schools and its impact, and where we're pushing forward in terms of a lot of the reconciliation, but I think more so just to be able to start to acknowledge and have the conversations about the impacts of boarding schools in our communities. Secretary Deb Haaland is also thankfully in her position at the Department of Interior, which in itself is a huge landmark for being the first Indigenous woman to be heading up in a department that was founded as a way to, as part of a process of exterminating us. So it's really historic in her role. And so I'm just going to quickly kind of move through some of the, as we continue to move into some of the different time periods of, the early 1920s. 1924 was the Indian Citizen Act was passed. And so this act was enacted as our first right to be able to vote. And so when you think about the timeline, that isn't very far along, long ago in terms of, and it was also still, while this act was in place, still trials and tribulations to be able to even practice that act. So really it took into the early 70s to really be able to freely, for Indigenous people to really freely vote. In 1934 was an Indian Reorganization Act, which was another act that gave tribes an ultimatum to be able to adopt a constitution government like the US or to be terminated. And so looking at the treaties that were established, looking at the reservations that were established. So this was another law and imposition that was forced upon our people to assimilate us into the US processes of governing. And so this kind of really dismantled a lot of traditional governance, as many tribes took on similar constitutions. But there's also still a lot of tribes that pushed back on this and are still using their traditional governance. The pueblos, many pueblos here in New Mexico, still govern by by their traditional governance standards. My community, we have adopted a constitution like many other tribal communities have throughout the US. And so in 1953 was another policy that was implemented, which was the termination policy, which was an attempt to basically terminate the legal sovereignty of tribal nations and its ongoing assimilation efforts. And so the termination policy was a way to take away the legal standings that were written out in our treaties and in our reservation documents. And so this was another policy that was forced upon that did have some impact on some tribal communities, but thankfully there was a lot of pushback, and it didn't have the type of impact that the president at the time had hoped for. In 1956, the Indian Relocation Act was also enacted to encourage many Indigenous people to leave reservations and to move to designated urban locations. And so there's a lot of urban relocation sites that have happened. And so Los Angeles, Cleveland, Oakland, up in the Northwest were deemed as relocation sites. And so many families saw this as an opportunity to leave the reservation and it was sold as that they would be getting a house with a white picket fence and a car and a garage. And so really a lot of the flyers that came into our communities at that time were pushing for this new life outside, that your life could be so much better. But in reality, when our people went to these relocation sites, they were oftentimes in the slums and really areas of the cities that were impoverished. And so it just ended up being a space that became challenging, and also, another process of disconnecting us from our homelands, disconnecting us from our language, and disconnecting us from our cultures and practices. And so there's still a lot of these, you'll find a lot of natives, indigenous people in these relocation areas. And there's also currently right now, if anyone's interested, at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, they have a curated exhibit up right now around the Indian Relocation Act. And so people who've been, whose families were part of that Indian relocation. And so we kind of move into the 1970s, which is us moving into the self-determination. And so 1972, the Indian Education Act was established, and this really was established a lot of the Bureau of Indian Education systems that are in place. And so really trying to move outside of the boarding school policies and into systems that pushed for education in a way that was supposedly to be driven by our own teachings, and which is still a challenge in itself today. In 1975, again, talking about the Indian self-determination, government's ability to enter into contracts with and receive grants from certain government agencies, and giving tribal nations greater control over our own affairs. And so this had an impact with our healthcare facilities, our governance systems, and just how we could function as sovereign nations. And so this really was something that a lot of tribes have taken into our own control to be able to be self-governing in this way. In 1978, the Indian Religious Freedom Act was finally implemented. And so this gave us the right to be able to practice our language and to practice our cultures. And so all up until this time of this law that was in place, we weren't supposed to be practicing our cultures. We weren't supposed to be speaking our language. And so this law was this policy was enacted, and I was born in 1978. And so literally in my lifetime, we were given the right to practice our culture and language. And so just to think about that, the history and the impacts of this structural racism, thankfully our people were resilient, and we continued to practice our culture. We continued to practice our language without these policies. And it's because of our ancestors and their perseverance to continue to fight for who we are that many of our languages still exist, and that many of our cultures still exist in our spirituality. But it has had detrimental impacts in a lot of our communities, because there is a lot of language loss, there is a lot of loss of culture, and there is a lot of loss of land. And so in the same year, the 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was also enacted. And this was to protect Native children from adoption and placement in foster care with non-natives, which was another assimilation process and policy as well, to place Native children with families who were non-native as a way to breed them out of their culture and their language. And so just going to kind of move into some more, more of the current. There's also a lot of other policies within that time frame from the 1980s and stuff, but just kind of moving into us in terms of how we think about how these federal policies have an impact still today. And so these are currently, when we think about land, and the impacts of loss of land and the impacts of environmental justice. The Dakota Access Pipeline, which was at Standing Rock, which was the Keystone double XL pipeline that was to bring oil from Canada in through our tribal lands, through community lands that impact our waterways, our lifeways. Thankfully, in January of this year, that President Biden canceled the Keystone pipeline. But after, there's already been a couple of spills, and currently right now, there's a Line 3, which is happening through the Minnesota Anishinaabe lands, and again, another pipeline that's coming from Canada and bridge that is moving its way through to pass through the Mississippi. So it doesn't just have impacts on Indigenous people, it has impacts of all people with regards to water and land, but it's driving through wetlands and waterlands and lakes that for the Anishinaabe is the breeding grounds for wild rice, which is a staple of the Anishinaabe people, which has been the staple that has sustained them for generations to this time. And so just wanted to be able to provide some advocacy in terms of, wanting to put this out there in terms of stopping the Line 3, because this is also other types of federal policies that are still happening today that still impact our way of life, that still impact our environment, that still impacts our land. And so I just wanted to wrap up with a quote from a friend and colleague of mine, Abigail Echohawk, who's the director of Urban Indian Health Institute. And so she's a poet as well, and she always has some really powerful words. And so just kind of wanted to acknowledge that, this, which I think is just really appropriate when we think about the history of our people. So we are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I am colonially underserved. I am institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient. So, thank you.